Hello, and welcome to Grief and Meaning Making, part of the Good Grief Festival. My name is Liesl Dawson, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. I'm delighted to introduce Robert Neimeyer, one of the giants in the field of grief. He is the director of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition and has published hundreds of articles and over 30 books, including Techniques of Grief Therapy and Grief and the Expressive Arts. He also has a new book coming out, which you can see on your screen, New Techniques of Grief Therapy, Bereavement and Beyond. So welcome, Bob. It's so wonderful to get a chance to speak to you. Can I start first just by asking you to say a little bit about how bereavement can involve a crisis of meaning?
Lisa, you go to the heart of the matter at the outset, and I like that attitude. In a culture where we sometimes push death to the margins, even in our professional training as psychotherapists. And of course, we live in a world awash in grief, from the loss of people, places, projects, possessions, professions. All of the attachments that define the core meaning and significance of our lives are up for grabs, and never more than in the world of impermanence that we've entered now in the context of the global pandemic. And Britons most particularly must be quite aware of the numerous losses of not only people, but resources that once defined our lives, whether those are the capacity to experience freedom, self-agency, predictability, basic world assumptions, and core beliefs on which we have relied for our social lives, our sense of identity, our most significant connections. And all of these, of course, are what confer meaning on human life. And they're precisely what is eroded or exploded by traumatic losses, as well as, of course, the more insidious losses of a way of life. So in this respect, I think it is very important, although we certainly understand grieving viscerally as a profoundly emotional experience, however stiff our upper lip may be, we know that it is something that can be deeply wounding for us at a heartfelt level, and indeed at an embodied level. But what we often miss is that, in some sense, the core of grief also includes an attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct, to rebuild a world of meaning that has been shaken by loss. Our life isn't the same. Our sense of what matters is not the same. Even our sense of who we are is shaped by whose we are. And when we lose those caring connections, our sense of self can become unmoored as well. So at many, many levels, grief is something that requires us to relearn the world and to relearn ourselves in a world made alien by the loss, unrecognizable. So that's the key focus of the work that we do in the Portland Institute, this kind of grief therapy training institution, the University Without Walls for training in grief therapy. So we try to take that very seriously. What's at stake for people when they experience profound loss?
That's really helpful. Thank you. Can you say a little bit more actually about the process of meaning making? And I'm thinking here both about your own experiences of grief and also your clinical experience. So how does one go about this process? What has it meant to you personally and professionally?
Well, on a personal level, as you invite me into that territory, I'll attempt to be discreet enough for your audience, but also honest enough to ground this in my own experience of 2020, which entailed some profound changes for me, including the shift from being a full-time university professor for 36 years, who also had a clinical practice and other things on the side. But in retiring from that and moving to a new town and to a new relationship, all of which then were immensely complicated by the rise of COVID, which began to wash over American shores back in March of last year. And of course, we're all keenly aware of how that's changed everything. In my case, it certainly complicated my connecting to the new community at a time when a close relationship might be standing on the other end of the driveway from a neighbor and having a conversation at the space of 4 meters or something. So that was playing out at a general level, while at a very specific level, the woman who I loved had gone to study yoga in an ashram in southern India. The short story is she's still there, fully a year later, and I'm still here, and the relationship has not survived that separation. So for me, the year was one of very profound grief for the loss of what I had understood to be my central life relationship, and the trauma of hope and denial of hope as a function of travel bans and the state of the COVID universe. Left me in about as deep a grief as I have ever felt. There were many times I simply collapsed to my knees and buried my face in a pillow on a sofa and just wept. And living alone in this house, I could weep and wail as loudly as I wanted to and needed to, without inhibition. And then I would drag myself up and head back into the day. As that loss began to be compounded by others, the death of other people in my social network, fortunately not yet a direct family member, but certainly some very good friends of some, 3 decades have died to COVID. And of course, we are very far from the end of it as we approach the 500,000 point of COVID deaths in the United States alone. In all of this, then, I certainly feel greatly impacted by these losses. The process is one then in which for me, the world that I thought I was living in, the future toward which I thought I was living, the loving attachments to people that comprise the nucleus of that universe, the kind of, the sun at the center of the solar system of my life, had just felt that it was extinguished. And I felt I was plunged into a kind of perpetual darkness. It would not be exaggerating it to say that I experienced a very complicating grief and a profound sense of depression. I stoically moved forward, but trying to reinvent a world that mattered in the aftermath of that was no easy task. And it is an ongoing task. It remains something that's implicitly written in invisible ink at the top of the to-do list for every day. And in that, but possibly at still more profound levels, many of your listeners, many of your viewers will have their own experiences. And they will be able to name names of people they have loved and lost. And if they were to ask themselves the question a dozen times, what have I lost? They could give a dozen profound answers that would probably include their sense of security, a feeling of predictability, maybe a sense of agency or freedom, a capacity to move toward a valued future. There would be the loss of all of these sort of world assumptions of how the world is or should be, right alongside the names of a grandmother, a parent, a sibling, a friend, and for some, a child lost by this condition of COVID, in addition to the many other ways that we continue to lose people. So whatever the circumstance, our world is changed by the losses we suffer. And the long process of moving through that towards something, again, livable is our central concern.
Well, I'm so sorry to hear what a hard year you've had. That seems like, a new location, COVID, and the loss of that relationship. I can absolutely see how you would feel as if the architecture of your life no longer feels, recognizable or indeed solid. Yes. So that makes perfect sense. How does one go about then trying to recreate or re-envisage a future, a new narrative, a story for oneself, when the kind of main points in the story have moved or disappeared?
Yeah. Well, your metaphor of the architecture of life changing is actually a wonderful place to attempt an answer to that, because here in Portland, and particularly in further west in our state, we had been ravaged also in 2020 by terrible wildfires that literally burned whole communities to the ground. Towns ceased to exist in the inferno. This was true in California as well. And this certainly made world headlines because of the enormity of the damage. In some ways, depending on, of course, the profundity of the grief and the profundity of the relationship or aspect of one's life lost to us, the grief might be analogized to a house fire that is extinguished before great damage is done, or, as in the case of the Oregon and California fires, a fire that levels us right down to our foundations. And so the task that we face, Liesl, can be one of needing to build our lives again from the ground up, that we may go back to the foundation stones and try to reassert the same house plan that was originally in place. But most commonly, we have to adapt to the changed circumstance. Sometimes we have to change residence altogether, and there's no repair and no rebuilding possible. So this is the radical challenge of grieving, is that it can reduce us to our very foundations. It requires us to look deeply at what those are. What are the core constituents of our lives? What matters to us, what always has, what still will, as we lean into a changed future. And it sometimes points us toward both the necessity and the possibility of a life very different than the one we had. If we are a parent who loses our only child, and perhaps we are beyond an age where we are likely to bear more children, then the life redesign required there is enormous. And of course, even if one were to lose a child under any circumstance, the life redesign is immense. And it's one that we do not easily take up. We are typically very reluctant to alter those attachments to the people, places, and possessions that we have loved and lost. So in grief, we stand in a state of almost ambivalence or inner contradiction. Part of us wants to hold fast to things just as they were, and yet an eternity will not return us to that earlier lifetime, at least in an earthly sense. And so in this earthly sense, we are forced to adapt. And of course, we may maintain loving bonds to the people and things that we have loved and lost physically, but every bereaved person will tell you that it is certainly not the same. However sweet the memory of the loved one, however they might enjoy continuing to circulate their stories, it's still a far cry from a human hug.
And so it's part of the one of the barriers, we might say, to meaning making and kind of somehow accepting the reality of a person's death, the wish to hang on to that relationship in the same form that one has had it, that there's a kind of resistance to the way that has to change in order to accommodate the reality of their death.
That's beautifully said. I do think that, among other things, grief takes the form of an urgent dialogue with ourselves, with one part wanting to stand firm, dig in our heels, and refuse the change that life is pressing upon us, while another part recognizes the necessity of that. And this is not to say, of course, that our changed life, our new life, maybe our reduced life, cannot also have a very important place, maybe even a very central place, for the very people we have loved and lost physically, but we need not lose them psychologically, emotionally, in some sense relationally, with or without a spiritual cosmology that promises an afterlife of reconnection, or a kind of quasi-literal dialogue with them in another dimension or in heaven. We still can retain a profound sense of connection and loving bond to those we've loved and lost. Learning how to do that might be at the heart of grief.
Yeah.
How do we move to reconstruct rather than relinquish a bond?
Yeah. And to find ways of making that external or somehow present in our lives. Can I ask, before we sort of move on with that, I want to hear more about that, but can I ask a question that I've wondered about quite a bit, which is that we tend to think about meaning making as something that's inherently positive. I think that the kind of the opposition seems to be between meaning making and a sense of meaninglessness or existential crisis, the sense of a void, of nothing there. But one thing I've wondered about is whether there are forms of meaning making that are negative or destructive, that we can, from our grief, make a narrative or story about, the world is dangerous, that grief is too high a price to pay for love. Right. And yes. That we actually don't want to engage. And I'm thinking here, at the back of my mind is a poem by Ben Jonson, which he wrote for his son who had died of the plague. And it ends with a very, it's not a very, it can be read in more than one way. It ends with a final line where he says, "As for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves may never like too much." And one of the ways of reading that is, I'm never going to invest again in the way that I've invested before. So that is a kind of meaning making.
Yes,
but it's,
this is.
Do you see what I mean? But is that still positive because it's a kind of narrative, or are there forms of meaning making that need to be, I don't know, resisted or watched?
Yes, I mean, of course, the world is awash in meanings, and sometimes deeply conflicted ones. So I do tend to think of these issues of, even as you raise it, for example, with Johnson's poetry, the kind of reconstruction of these core beliefs about the safety or advisability of attachment to people. This can be taken on board in an embittered, distanced, self-protective kind of a way, where I become compulsively self-reliant and refuse the beauty of the world and relationships. Or one can take a very similar stance, recognizing the impermanence of all things, right? All possessions, all attachments, and with a kind of Buddhistic transcendence, end up nonetheless very much enjoying and inviting the intimacy of life, a present moment contact, a kind of full-bodied engagement in the world, but with, even in the face of the proviso that this is temporary and perhaps made more precious because of that. So
and you can see the kind of utility of that thinking, and you can also see the way that, even if, to my mind, that doesn't seem like a good philosophy of life, it is still an idea that's perhaps integrating the reality of his son's death into his own sense of future, sense of self. So it still is a kind of narrative.
That's right.
I wonder if we could go back now to continuing bonds, because I sort of jumped in with this, and we just had gotten to the point of thinking about meaning making, and a really important part of that is maintaining that relationship with the person who's died, but in this new form. And I'm interested in hearing you talk about this. And also, I suppose one thing I've come across in some grief literature is this difference between certain kinds of behaviors, repetitive behaviors, that are about remembering the person who's died, that seem to get someone into a kind of cognitive loop, where they're going back over. So it's important to see the death, to integrate the death, but there's a version where it doesn't seem to be being processed.
Right.
And then a different version which seems to be about this new relationship, the continuing bonds, and
Right.
the ways that we do that through, ritual or new practices in our lives or symbols. So sorry, that's way too long of a question. So you can take whatever bit of that you like.
I think the best questions simply point us in a given direction and give us a nudge, and then we just move into the space of the problem description. So, I suppose the problem description is, how do we reconstruct a bond with those who have died? And there clearly are a plenitude of ways that we can do that. As you point out, one of the functions of ritual, both sacred and secular, is to offer forms of that and guidelines. And sometimes that can be very descriptive and prescriptive. I think about Orthodox Jewish friends, one, for example, who recently lost her father. And there are a plenitude of rituals that go from sitting Shiva, even if one's doing it now in front of a computer screen, rather than having people literally come by the house, on through, various memorials that take place a year out from the death and so on, the unveiling of the tombstone. So we have those ways of ritual remembrance that are available to us. These have the advantage of also placing our own suffering and our own grief in a larger context of meaning that has been perhaps refined, but in some sense maintained for thousands of years in some of these ancient traditions. Likewise, we can have our contemporary rituals that may only have a 20-year history of posting blogs to our loved ones online on memorial sites, writing them electronic kind of open letters. Dear Liesel, I will never forget the day that we had our interview. Right, these sorts of very personal, almost chatty connections. So whether they are classic or contemporary, we need our rituals of remembrance, our rituals of reconnection. However, we also have rituals of rumination, if you will. And in psychiatric terms, ritualistic behavior means the repetitive performance of concrete acts in a way that is dysfunctional. And certainly we can also see that. The widow or widower or the bereaved parent who leaves the bedroom of the, once occupied by the loved one, precisely as it was for the next 30 years, and invites, few new relationships into her or his life in order to, in some sense, continue to revise and update their web of caring attachments. It's as if they grow only smaller and more threadbare across time. And in general, even the kind of cognitive aspect of rumination, of going over and over and over again, for example, the events of the death, seemingly in an attempt to mentally reverse it, to make it not so, to attribute blame and fault, often to the self, and sometimes to significant, relevant others in one's life, can produce a kind of embitterment, a kind of guilt, a kind of blame and shame that can be very corrosive of relationships. And yet it is fully understandable when one is trying to take on board such a horrific story.
In a clinical context, how do you help people who seem to be stuck in this repetitive reliving, rumination, self-blame? How do you help them to sort of change their story?
Well, there are many answers to that, and maybe I can give you just a handful on a range from the simple to the more complex. On the simple side of things, one can certainly empathize with the implied need to sort through the story. Often it is the fact that they have been unaccompanied well by others who provide anything more than simple consolation as they contend with the story. So maybe this isn't on the simple side after all, but if we practice a kind of listening that is non-anxious, generous, but that also provides kind of equal measures of caring and daring, so we're providing support, but we're also challenging people to, for example, to retell slowly the story of the loss. It might be over a period of an hour or more, and to do so in a way that they attend to not only the shocking or tragic external narrative episodes, what's happening when, I discovered my loved one motionless in bed. I called the doctors. I was at the hospital. He died. But also then to weave that external narrative strand together with an internal narrative strand of a kind of deep recollection and voicing of what was happening in you at that time that you first encountered his kind of still body in that bedroom. And when you made that call, what were you aware of when the emergency health workers on the other end answered the line, and when they arrived at the house and you heard their talk between themselves as they dealt with him? What was going through you as that was going on around you? And so we slowly reconstruct both the internal and the external narrative. And then the third strand of the braid is really the meaning-oriented narrative. What did you think was happening at that time? What did that mean to you when the doctor said that? And so we're helping the person put together a fuller and more integrated story that goes somewhere rather than that just endlessly loops in this space without feedback, without elaboration, without greater coherence, without any novelty. People are just kind of cycling in the same rut. So that kind of what we call restorative retelling can be one way through rumination.
Yeah, I can really see that. And I guess the sense that, the way you describe it, I almost get a sense of that repetitive reliving or retelling as almost a form of avoidance, that actually it's not integrating the experience, but almost trying to undo the experience. And I can see how really slowing someone down can, allow for a much fuller looking at the experience.
That's right.
That's happening, and integrating it, accommodating it in some way. So
yeah, I think that's well said. There are elements of avoidance. We may be avoiding weaving in the strands that have to do with what we prefer not to have to contend with, and of course that is ultimately includes the need to change the story, to revise the story, to begin writing a new chapter, and not to keep rereading the current one.
And why symbolic, forms of representing the relationship are more powerful, because again, they're adaptable, and they allow that relationship to change and evolve, but for that person still to be present, but in a new way, in a non-physical way.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. That's really the core of it. I think of it in terms of a tension that plays out along a dimension of time, that we move from saying, or intending in a way to retreat to a place where the world was as it had been, right, at a better time when the person was still living. That retreat to the past is, obviously precludes our full engagement in the present. And if we're able to switch the object of our bonding to not how can I go back to a place that I had the bond, and to ask the question, how can I carry my loved one with me into a changed future? Then it's a kind of question that profoundly respects the relationship, but that in a sense extends the existence and relevance of our loved one in the world into a world yet to be, and one about which we may have some important decision making to contend with. What do I do now? And how do I carry conversations about my ex-wife who died into my new relationship? How can I continue to honor the life of the child I have who died in infancy with my still living children as they age into adolescence?
You can see why different kinds of charity, becoming an advocate, if your child died in a car accident,
right.
with some problem in terms of the seatbelt or the road, that you become an advocate, that is a really powerful way
yes.
of kind of carrying your loved one forward, but in a way
Absolutely.
that creates new meaning. So you can see, a lot of people do who get through these difficult periods. I think you can see them using their loss
That's
as
right.
a force for good in some ways, and you can see how that is a very powerful form of those bonds continuing.
Yeah, when we can't lose our loss, we can at least use our loss, and we can use it for compassionate aims, right? And if we were to look at the number of charities formed in honor of a deceased person, it would account for the great majority of all charitable organizations throughout the world, whether they are organized around a very specific objective or not. And certainly advocacy groups of the kind that you're describing, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, these are very important, groups that join together to mitigate the tragedy of opioid addiction and death or suicide, and
it gives people a community as well. It allows them to come together, which again sort of mitigates against the loneliness and isolation of grief, which we know for people it is a very lonely experience.
Yeah. And that underscores something else too, Liesl, that I'm glad that you bring that up so clearly, is that meaning making is not just something we do in our heads. It is not, making an excuse for what happened. It is not accepting what happened in the simple sense of saying, oh, okay, that's just. It is instead contending with how to live with injustice. And as you point out in these kind of moves toward greater social engagement around the loss, attempting to overcome and mitigate such injustice in the future for others too.
And I think that hits also, when you lose someone you love, your life narrative might be a collaborative story with them. So
yes.
you're losing not just your own narrative, but you might be losing the person with whom that narrative is generated and who also reflects back a version of you. So you kind of lose all of those things, and they're hard to do on their own. So in some ways, I think it's not that people are replaceable, but that we need people to hear us, to validate our experiences.
People. Yeah, it's like an old Barbara Streisand song. I agree with you fully.
No,
meaning is a social construct. It may arise within us, but it certainly arises between us at every level, from our most intimate whispered encounters with an intimate other, to family conversations over the dinner table, or at a holiday period, right on through to the larger cultural discourses of even the way we describe bereavement and respond to it. All of this is something that's negotiated with other people. So meaning making is a communicative act.
Yeah. I'm interested in the fact that you are a poet as well as a psychotherapist, and you've published poems. Some of them deal explicitly with loss.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the way that you as a therapist and you as a poet, how those are different modes of meaning making, whether poetry does something different for you.
I do think that we confront a landscape of loss in our lives when we experience profound bereavement. The landscape has changed, and it's often made so alien by the loss that all of our old maps no longer work. Everything's rearranged. The road along which we were driving, or the trail along which we were hiking, meets with a dead end, and it's impassable. And so we have to trailblaze and find a different direction. And there's no Google Maps that will help us do it.
And do you find at certain moments that poetry is the thing that helps you express how you're feeling, that, more than journaling or something else, suddenly,
For me, yes, because I can utilize the literal, but I can also transcend it. And so here's one that refers to one of those knee-dropping moments of weeping into the cushion on the couch with the collapse of this relationship that I referred to. And so this is one that I wrote back in probably about April of last year. And I called it Old Shoes. Old shoes. I'm wearing old shoes and will for a while yet, the grief still holding close. Sometimes when the longing for a single living thing overcomes me like a sudden hunger, I shuffle from the black mirror to the long grass painted in dew and jerk the mower into a sputtering roar as I walk the tight lines, feet slipping in the mud, just to smell the cut grass, remove it in clots from the black bag, and hold it just a moment more, like memories, before releasing it to compost. Now, that's a literal experience I had, but it also becomes a metaphor for one whole season of my grieving in this last year. And so I think that grief allows us, poetry allows us in some sense to view our grief less literally, to find poignant expression for what literal language can't easily convey. It can work for us in many different ways. I could also read you far more upbeat poems that also reflect with a lot of gratitude the love that helped bear me through that on the part of many friends. This is a poem.
That's beautiful though. And I'm just very struck by the earth, the compost, that there's something about the landscape, the earth, the textures, the soil that kind of keep coming through. And I don't have a theory about it yet, but it's just very
well. Let me know if you
striking.
find one. I hadn't really thought of that so explicitly myself. But I do imagine that when we are profoundly grieving, we are feeling unmoored, uprooted. We've lost our footing in the world. We are not grounded, and we are seeking new grounding. We're seeking a new foundation or soil for our life, and so perhaps implicitly that quest is finding its way into these poems.
And again, this kind of new landscape, as you say, and new, the kind of alienation from the landscape, from the world that we know. Mm-hmm. I'm aware that we probably should wrap up fairly soon because I think we've taken just about our time, but it's been an absolutely amazing, really rich conversation. I've so appreciated you bringing so much yourself as well to this conversation and sharing with us how difficult your year has been. And I think for many people listening who have experienced similar losses of people, but also lives and contexts and places, I think they will be able to really connect with what you've said. I just want to say thank you really for this amazing.
Well, I appreciate your being such an excellent partner in dialogue, and I appreciate the good work that you have invited me to here by inviting me to this party. I am pleased for the kind of festival to which you are contributing so centrally. I think we need a lot more cultural discourses around these collective and highly particular losses that we are all having to contend with. And there are new meanings to be made in them, I am confident. And I trust that if we're able to do this together in a spirit of compassion, those meanings can be made in constructive ways. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Bye.
Bye now.